we get to the end of the season or towards the end of the season, and for me, that's the number one time to scout. Right when the season ends is the time where you can pick up sign from the fall. It actually means something. A lot of times you scout in March, April, for example, and you can be very confused, or it can be very misleading because you're seeing sign that's winter sign and yarding sign and deer that have migrated, herded up areas. I think you can say the same for turkeys. Turkeys seem to flock up this time of the year. We're starting to see turkeys on one food plot and then on another, and then they're half mile apart, and there's 12 here and there's 13 over here, and we don't see that many turkeys. We don't have that many in the spring. It's kind of, and then pretty soon they'll be gone. In the winter they're gone somewhere. So deer are kind of similar in that, even living in the UP of Michigan where I live, they would literally yard 25 miles away, 20 miles away, 15 miles away from where their home range was during the summer and the fall. Then they go back, and so very misleading. Obviously, if someone was scouting sign in March in a deer yard, it would look like, boy, this is the spot to be in November, when the deer aren't even there till January or December, depending on the weather. So I think it's very critical, that timing of what to scout. But one of the things I really want you to look at when you're scouting, this doesn't matter if it's public or private land, if you use trail cameras, you can tell a lot by a trail cam picture where that deer is actually bedding. And it's whether you're reflecting on your own property or where you hunt on public land. Someone the other day, they were hunting on public land, and they were talking to me, and they said, the deer are consistently coming to the bait pile that they had at 1, 2, 3 in the morning. And they assume that there's a swamp nearby, 200 or 300 yards away, and that's where those bucks are coming from. And folks, if they're coming from 200, 300 yards away, a quarter mile away, they're going to show up during the daylight. And it might not be all the time, but they're going to be in and around daylight, and they're not going to be in the middle of the night. And so this first point right here, what I've seen time and time again, we analyze our client trail cams. They're trying to decipher what a certain buck's doing on their property. We spend the entire day with them. Whether it's my own, up in the UP of Michigan, when I had that, starting trail cameras in 1998, and then all the ag land that I have, working with clients, you see a direct correlation with the trail cam time equaling the distance traveled. And what I mean by that, it's not an exact 100 yard per hour. But what I mean by is that if you are getting trail cam photos in your area of a buck that's 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, he's coming from a certain direction, he's coming from a long ways away to get there. Bucks feed 5 times in a 24-hour period, just like the rest of the deer herd. They like to hit their biggest and best food source right before dark because they've been sitting eating twigs and sticks and browse during the daylight. And they'll go to wherever is safe, social, open. A lot of times those public land bucks are going to the big open hardwoods. You see all these tracks out there. It's very misleading because you think, wow, those tracks in the snow must mean those bucks or those deer are going to be there during the daylight, and they're not. They're coming from a long ways away. That's a safe and social spot. They can avoid predators out in the open like that, and they can hit food sources they wouldn't otherwise hit during the daylight because it's so open. And so what you see all the time and time again, is if that buck is coming in the middle of the night, he's coming from a long ways away. And that's something you need to realize and recognize, because if you have private land, you can look at, boy, there's some holes in my property. How come that buck is staying so far away? If you just look at it like, oh, he's nocturnal, he's living 200 yards away, you don't learn anything. You don't know how to improve your property. You don't accept the fact. You're not critical with yourself and your land to say, where is he really coming from and why? Why is he not living closer? And now I see with that you'll see a difference between ag land and big open woods and wilderness. In big open woods and wilderness, deer are used to traveling a greater distance. There's not a lot of deer, so they'll travel long ways during the daylight sometimes because they have the protection of cover. They don't have a lot of hunters, so in those vast wilderness areas where there's not a lot of hunters, not a lot of deer, they'll travel a much greater distance during the daylight. But what you also see is not only does the time of the trail camera indicate, if they're a half hour after dark, they're probably pretty close. If they're an hour after dark, they might be pretty close. But when you start talking 2-3 hours or more, they're probably pretty far away. Now, obviously, if they're back on the land and you see them and you get a picture a half hour before daylight, they're probably bedding in and around the land because they're going back to bed at that point. What we also see is the further that they're away from your land, the more infrequent the pictures will be. And it makes sense. If a buck is actually living 1.5 miles away from your land where you're getting pictures of him, he's got a lot of other directions and other things that can attract him, attractions, deer, whatever it might be, food sources, to pull his attention in a direction other than your land, the further out he gets. So what you find is the further he's away, also the the frequency of pictures will reflect that. Meaning you don't get a lot of pictures of him if he's a long ways away. And so you can kind of put those two together. It just makes sense. It's common sense stuff, but unfortunately in today's age where you're looking at, well, a buck has a three mile home range, you don't know where he's at, he could be anywhere. That's not true. You'll find that it's very definitive that a buck is very random, if that makes sense. Meaning very random, you're not getting a lot of pictures of him, he's more in the middle of the night, then definitively he's staying somewhere else. And you can draw conclusions to that just common sense wise. If he's close, he'd be moving. Again, they're moving 5 times in 24 hours to feed. Now, during the daylight, that might mean he gets up in a clear cut or hardwood regeneration area, briar area, and they might move 50 yards. Now, if it's during the rut, he might move further, obviously. He's chasing does and moving around, but just in generally to try to figure out where his core area is. And I talk about core and non-core areas a lot. Non-core bucks are those bucks that you only see during the rut. You might see them in a late season food source. They're just occasionally passing by. That's that non-core because he lives somewhere else, his core is somewhere else. That core buck, you'll see pictures in and around your land frequently, and then also closer to daylight. Big woods, like I said, when it comes to big woods and wilderness, deer will travel a lot further. So a lot of you public land hunters out there, if you're getting a picture on a scrape on a ridge top down in southeast Ohio in a big public land area, you might find that you're getting a picture in and around shooting hours up on that ridge top. Well, he's close. He's really bedding close, especially when it's mid-October, especially when it's end of November into December and he's not rutting and it's frequent. You know that he's pretty close. On the other hand, if he's 2 miles away, he's probably going to come in at 2 in the morning. He's going to come in at midnight. He's going to come in at 3. He has a long ways to go to get there. Even on public land, they're not going to typically travel 2 hours and get there right at daybreak, or 2 hours and get there right at the close of light. He's coming from a long ways away. And so big woods, you see greater distances. And ag land, you might look at it that this buck is traveling from that woodlot to this woodlot. There's a lot of open ground in between. They'll go through open ground quickly after dark. But bottom line is I find that their movements are a lot more confined. You typically don't see a buck from a long ways away unless they're being pushed. So I've heard of guys and hunters in southwest Wisconsin, they do deer drives around Thanksgiving and they'll shoot a buck that someone else had trail cam photos of 2.5 miles away. That's common when you're doing deer drives, when you're kicking deer around and you're kicking them out of their core areas. But just in general movement, you can expect on ag land, if you're getting a picture an hour after dark, maybe he came from Earth 3 hours after dark, 5 hours after dark. Maybe it's that difference of a quarter mile to a mile. Where on big public land wilderness area, you might be that buck that you're getting at 2 in the morning. He might have come from 2 miles away, 2.5 miles away, 1.5 miles away through a swamp, through thick cover that he takes him a long time to get through. And of course, those pictures will be a lot less frequent. So ag land, look at that total movement to be shorter overall, maybe 1 mile, 1.5 miles at most. Public land, you could extend that to 2 miles, 2.5 miles, where they're going to go a lot further, they're going to range a lot further. And so that helps you because, someone was saying the other day, it's kind of like, these bucks are coming in the middle of the night, I'm going to sit and wait them out. Well, their daylight movements might be 1.5 miles away. So if you have a direction that they're coming from, and you know that time frame, start looking out probably a lot further than you normally would. If you have open hardwoods, if you have open fields, know that they're going to cross that after dark. It's going to be a long time. They're not going to they might show up a half hour after dark, but they might have gone through a half-mile field to get there out in the open because they don't want to cross that opening during the dark. So that puts them to that next woodlot over. It might be that when you're hunting in ag land, it might be that a neighbor that's 1.5 miles away, and that's one of the next woodlots is going to be hunting a certain weekend. A buck comes from that direction, possibly even their property. Well, you might want to sit on that side of your property waiting for a non-core buck to come in the end of October because those neighbors are hunting. They're up for the weekend. We used to drive by down Reedstown where we hunted. We drove by the neighbors 80. They had a chain across there from Chicago, and if their chain was undone and tire tracks are going in and out of their land and cabin, we might change where we hunt because they were very invasive. Their cabin was in the middle. They had all open timber. They would use ATVs to get to stands. So whenever they hunted, by that Saturday evening, Sunday morning of a weekend, we'd start seeing bucks we don't normally see because they'd be pushed over our way. We'd even see the same with turkeys. You could count on seeing more turkeys if they were down there running around with ATVs and pushing things around. Think about that. Think about, where can I hunt this deer during the daylight? Because a buck's core daylight area is the most sacred place in the woods. It's not very big. Think about it. Ag land. Let's say if his core range during the daylight was a mile, square mile, he'd die because there's 40 acres, 80 acres, 200 acre parcels, 500 acre parcels. If he was living a mile apart during the daylight and he frequently moved during the daylight a mile, then he's going to cross a lot of borders. He's going to be exposed to a lot of hunters, bow, gun, whatever it might be, all season long, and he'd die. He wouldn't make it to that mature buck age. I find the older a buck becomes, the smaller his daylight core areas. We've had bucks that you get 600 pictures of them here, you get 5 pictures over here, and that's it. And it's because his core range is so small the older he becomes, and you see that typically. Now when he gets into late season food sources, when they dry up, he might move a long distance. They know where to find that food. If you spook him, he might go a mile and a half over there. But he's got a barbell. He's got a small home range here, he's got a small home range over there, and he might move in between under the cover of darkness. But it helps you because not only can you look at and say, you know, he might be bedding over there during the daylight. I need to get my rear end over there, hunt on the outside of that area in the evening when he's coming out, maybe hunt on the back side of the bedding area in the morning when he's going in. Especially for public land hunters, you can be very mobile. You can use thousands of acres that you have as your playground. But also on private land, when you see that he's probably staying, and when you realize he's probably staying a mile away or more, it helps you address the deficiencies of your own land. What can I do better next time to attract him more during the daylight? What are the deficiencies of my land? Why is he way over there and not here? And we talk about that in a lot of areas. You know, there's a lot of times when we see private landowners, they might even have a 110 acre piece, 120 acre piece. This little area over here is supported by food, this 30, 40 acres, but this area over here isn't. So then dominant doe family groups take over that. Maybe one mature buck relates to it, but there's really not enough room for anything else. So having multiple food sources, you need to have a certain amount of food per every 20, 30 acres. Then that's a way that you can fit more deer on a smaller parcel, because you have little micro movements that are complementary of each other, they're not running into each other. So bucks can slot into their own little range, and we look at that. It's the same with public land. You're looking at, if there's just one bedding area, one food source movement, you're probably going to have one mature buck, you have some doe family groups closer to the food, and not much in between. But if you have multiple options for bedding cover, and you have some fairly big distant food sources, I'm thinking public land next to ag, public land next to clear cuts, fresh clear cuts, you'll even see those bucks move 3 miles, 2 miles from one year to the next because they're following the fresh clear cuts where there's more of a bounty of food. So think about that. Think about that when you're scouting, when you're reflecting on your own land, your pictures on public land, and try to really realize that, man, if you're getting this buck, he's coming in, you're getting pictures of him infrequently, middle of the night, he's around, he's alive, but he's living somewhere else during the daylight. Where he's at living during the daylight, that's his sacred core area. It's the golden spot where you can actually set up an assemblage of stands on the outside as he's coming out to go to a distant food source, backside of the bedding area in the morning. So you have that afternoon setup, that morning setup, and really look at those distances, really understand that does affect and really illustrates how far that buck is actually living away from your land. And then, of course, again, with private land, look to changes you can make to try to get him there more often during the daylight. Because when you find where he's at during the daylight, that's where you're going to find that you can kill him a consistent amount of time. Yeah, he might show up if he's coming from a long ways. There's a lot of people out there that have to rely on the rut to kill their buck. Don't be that person. There's a lot of opportunity. That buck's still moving during daylight, during the October lull, early season, late season. You just have to find that, and this is one way to do so. It can really help you, whether you still have some late season hunting left, but certainly planning for your land and your scouting efforts on public land for next season. Hey, I'm really excited to introduce to you our Hills and Thermals web class. It's something we worked on all year. We're trying to put lots of facets of scouting, aerial imagery, diagrams on the whiteboard to really teach you how the wind moves through hills and how you should find bedding areas, how it relates to deer movements in general, how that relates to, this is a bedding area stand, this is a food source afternoon stand. We really tried to put this together and offer you a complete picture of how to navigate hills and find better success consistently where you hunt.